You found us through fly fishing. You'll stay for our passion and the community. Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing podcast.
Yeah, but he doesn't get it. How come fly fishermen don't get it?
You only haul with the short power snap.
Look for where people walk and the insides of bends and hunt those.
The roof blew off and the interior walls got sucked out. And the trees are just coming up. And I mean, he's clearly not going to clear the trees.
It is not a fly fishing story. It's a story about me trying to understand my brother through fly fishing.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today.
Today's episode is sponsored by Togens Fly Shop, who provides superior quality products at an affordable price. An amazing resource for fly tying materials, tools, and fishing accessories. Since 2005, Togens has been over-delivering on price, service, and passion. And now you can check out that Togens buzz for yourself. Right now, you can head over to wetflyswing.com/Togens to get started. That's Togens. You support this podcast by clicking through that link to Togens online. Today's episode is sponsored by Daiichi Fishing Hooks, a leader in the fly fishing industry and still the world's sharpest hook. Tempered with carbon-rich steel, Daiichi offers superior penetration without compromising the hook's structural integrity. You can head over right now to wetflyswing.com/Daiichi and check out what they have going and check out these killer hooks. That's Daiichi, Daiichi. We've been waiting for you. Follow our guests, follow us on Instagram, and share this episode and the love if you enjoy this podcast. And we are live in 3, 2, 1. How you doing, James?
I'm doing good.
Great. I'm excited about the conversation we're going to have today because we're going to talk about brook trout, a species that I think a lot of people love around the country. You know, whether you're East Coast or West Coast, I was just talking to somebody out in the Yellowstone area, and they were talking about how brook trout are a very popular species in some of the still waters out there. So I want to dig into all the brook trout. You know, I think we're going to focus a little more on the East Coast today. But before we get there, talk about how you came to be in the conservation. How did you come to be focusing on brook trout, or what's your background here?
I'm not a subject matter expert. I actually what I do in my capacity as a volunteer for Pennsylvania Native Fish Coalition is it's called science communication. So I take kind of this esoteric kind of technical fisheries science, research findings. And what I do is I kind of read through these papers and I discuss them often with the authors, the real PhDs, the real fishery scientists. And I try to get a message distilled down to, what the layperson can easily understand on the importance and the findings of some of this fisheries science and what the implications are for anglers, stakeholders, and naturalists, people who want to see these native fish stick around.
Gotcha. Okay. And do you focus on a certain region, area, and species, or how does that look for what you do?
So since I'm one of the board members of PA Native Fish Coalition, I just work in the state of Pennsylvania on issues facing native fish. So anyone not familiar with Native Fish Coalition, it's a grassroots, donor-funded 501c3 nonprofit that essentially was formed for the protection and restoration and advocacy of native fish. So my Pennsylvania chapter within Pennsylvania is where I kind of do this outreach and communication. How I got into it was I'm just an angler like everyone else listening to this podcast. I'd been obsessed with kind of fishing and streams and, what lives in them and lakes ever since I was a young kid. And when I, after college and graduate school, I kind of, got into the whole fly fishing scene in Pennsylvania. I had previously been a fly fisherman since I was, like 10 or 12, but in New Jersey and New York. And when I got here, I realized that, slowly through just getting exposure to different people that there was kind of a big divide between anglers' kind of knowledge of what was affecting, native fish species, mainly native brook trout, versus fisheries scientists' kind of understanding. And I kind of saw that there was two very different perspectives, one of, kind of myths and pessimism more so on the angling side, and then one of kind of optimism and a much more nuanced understanding of native brook trout's conservation status on the fisheries science side.
Oh, nice. And yeah, and I think you might have listened to one of the episodes. We had I believe it was a professor that talked about brook trout. And I think part of that picture was a little bit dim. And we hear this sometimes throughout where you talk about especially now with climate change, aridification, whatever you want to call it, temperatures are warmer, streams are warmer. And I think a lot of people are worried. They think, maybe are we going to be able to save these brook trout? So paint the optimistic, why should we be optimistic about brook trout? Happy
to. So, when we look at what affects native brook trout and why we're losing them, climate change is obviously, in the literature, something that is very important. You can't talk about native brook trout conservation status without climate change. However, another aspect of native brook trout conservation that, I'll say you can't talk about native brook trout without talking about it is invasive fish species. And it's kind of ironic that I say that because we really don't talk about it. In terms of climate change, any species faced with a stressor over a given period of time, it's going to have adaptation strategies that will either be successful or not successful. And when you look at brook trout, obviously with climate change, cold water is what we're talking about. So, however, there's areas in the brook trout's native range where the water is plenty cold. It's not, the effects of climate change have not really hit those watersheds to a degree that they are uninhabitable for brook trout. So there's plenty of streams out there that run in the high 50s, low 60s, in the dog days of summer, at least in Pennsylvania. And native brook trout aren't in those streams anymore, and they're not choked with sediment. These are fully forested streams. So the question is if climate change is not appearing to be the kind of deal breaker there, what is? And that's what led me to kind of get into reading all this stuff and talking with these fisheries scientists because, I didn't understand why we have watersheds and streams in Pennsylvania that on paper, they're cold, they're clean, they're forested, they don't have brook trout. So digging a little bit deeper, I looked at, there was a status and threats assessment done by the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture, which is a, collection of partners and states working to on brook trout conservation in the East and its native range. And I looked at Pennsylvania, and this was back in the early 2000s when they compiled the threats for brook trout in Pennsylvania. Invasive brown trout were actually third, ahead of development and urbanization, and in terms of how prevalent they are. And the more I read about this stuff, the more I saw that there were these effects of invasive fish species. They predated and ate brook trout. They essentially, in climate change, these thermal refuge or cool springs or cold areas come worth their weight in gold. And I started to find research that these invasive trout species pushed brook trout out of thermal refuge into hotter water where they couldn't survive. So it wasn't necessarily that the stream was too warm. It was that the brook trout had these adaptation strategies of using the thermal refuge in cold water that the invasive trout were then stopping that adaptation strategy. Other things that I found were invasive, brown and rainbow trout in the East cause, a barrier effect, much like a bad culvert that fish can't get up. There were studies done showing that these species were actually stopping brook trout from moving through systems like a culvert. And they could tell this because they looked at the genes from the brook trout, and the genes of one population wasn't getting into the genes of another population, kind of illustrating that barrier effect. So there was this whole litany of, effects from these invasive species. And it was kind of like the elephant in the room. And all I heard people talking about was climate change, warming, and, habitat loss, development. And no one was talking about why all these, forested streams and state parks, state game land, or national forests here in Pennsylvania were getting overrun with invasive species. And the narrative was replacement, not displacement. Everyone said, oh, well, climate change is just getting hotter, and, these brook trout can't survive in these streams anymore. And, if you go temp them, that certainly wasn't the case based on their preferred temperature range in a lot of cases. In other cases, it was, kind of close, but those adaptation strategies and hot weather and hot stream temps were, are likely being affected there. So the optimism in native brook trout conservation comes from the fact that when you look at climate change and you acknowledge it as a serious threat, but then you look at the invasive species aspect, we haven't taken our foot off the gas pedal on the invasive species aspect in Pennsylvania. We have the third most hatchery raised salmonids in the whole United States in Pennsylvania. And we have essentially launched, an invasion of invasive hatchery trout that has been around since the times of, since the 1800s in Pennsylvania. So when you think about, wow, you have all these big kind of scary things like climate change, urbanization, habitat loss, no one thinks about like, man, we've launched a man-made assault of millions and millions of invasive, trout species.
Yeah, invasive brown trout.
On native brook trout in these cold, clean, forested streams. And we've never seen what brook trout can do without this kind of man-made assault.
Right. What is you mentioned brown trout was the number 3 impact. What were the top 2 above invasive species?
I think sedimentation and land use. So it kind of ties in with Pennsylvania is a very agriculture heavy state and a lot of deforestation. We're also kind of a lumber producing state. And there were times in Pennsylvania's history when you would look at the mountains and they were just dirt hills. Every single tree had been taken. There's breathtaking, in a bad way, photos from the logging era in the northern tier of PA where they're just dirt mounds. And, you can imagine at that time, brook trout, that devastated them. But then at the same time as they were dealing with that, you took this invasive species and you kind of piled that on top of them. So as the brook trout were getting wiped out and, no one was really, and that was happening, they also had to deal with this invasion launched by, the post-colonial era human beings.
Right. And so those have been there for a while. So those have been there for, that's amazing, 200 years. Is there stats that show 200 years of, that's a long time, right? Brown trout have been there. Are you seeing brook trout now declining at a higher rate than they say 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Or do they have trends and tracking? Are they tracking that?
Well, here's the alarming part is that Pennsylvania Fish and Boat, who is, theoretically responsible for, brook trout conservation, one of their kind of glaring, shortfalls is they're not currently looking at where these brook trout are replacing brown trout. They have a deliverable in their trout management plan that I don't even think they've started on yet. But 75% of the brook trout deliverables in their trout management plan from the early 2000s are just left delivered. So I don't, in terms of them looking at where brown trout, or invasive brown trout are displacing brook trout, that's something they're really behind on. And that's a theme you'll see throughout this entire podcast is PA is kind of in the Stone Ages when it comes to native brook trout conservation. We can talk a little bit later, but our neighbors are kind of putting us to shame.
Oh, okay, so there are other people doing that. Was going to be my question. So let's just say in general, keep a high level. If you went out to anglers, I guess, those people that love brown trout and brook trout, and you said, hey, here's the deal. We can restore brook trout populations, no problem. The only thing is we have to remove all brown trout, and you can't fish for brown trout because they're going to be gone. What do you think the response would be from fly anglers? And do you think it would change over time? Do you think that's something people could get behind?
So that is most people's initial reaction, actually, when they hear me, use the word invasive brown trout or invasive rainbow trout. They think that terminology means that they will be removed from all the celebrated, classic kind of, invasive brown trout fisheries. And that's not the case, because we don't even have the technology to remove invasive brown and rainbow trout from these larger waterways. What we're really talking about is we're talking about, a few very carefully selected smaller streams with barriers in place. And we're talking more about kind of saving, brook trout in areas where we can, rather than, people kind of get this picture in their head of like, tanker buses and like, military planes dropping rotenone from the sky.
Right.
and that's not the case. We're more at risk of losing all our brook trout than we are of losing all of our invasive brown and rainbow trout in Pennsylvania by far. So, people really just don't seem to be aware that out of 4,000 to 5,000 invasive species on planet Earth, brown trout are actually ranked in the top 30. And a lot of people, because of how they have been portrayed and celebrated in the angling literature, are not aware that, brown trout have dominated every continent except Antarctica in terms of their suitable range. I've seen literature from McIntosh and a bunch of other researchers from 2011 saying that wild invasive brown trout occupy nearly 100% of their suitable range on planet Earth. So, people aren't aware that you got invasive brown trout in the Himalayas, threatening native Himalayan snow trout. People aren't aware that you have brown trout in New Zealand threatening native galaxids and causing their disappearance. They're not aware that in middle to southern Africa, you have them collapsing native fish populations there. So there's that whole kind of dichotomy between, yes, they are an invasive species and one of the world's most highly invasive, and rainbows being in the top 100, not the top 30. But we cannot remove them from these huge celebrated fisheries.
No. And we love them, right? That's the other thing. And you go back to, right, part you mentioned, I think, the parts of you go to the West, they're trying to eradicate, you look at the Yellowstone area, right, out of the Upper Snake. They're trying to eradicate some of those rainbows and browns. They're focusing on the cutthroat, right?
Yes,
and so, but is this more of sounds like what you're saying is you narrow down to these really tiny pockets where we know we can keep these populations, but you really aren't thinking like regionally or even over the country. You're not thinking like, hey, you're going to restore all of these populations. You're really focused very narrowly.
Yeah, so that's the thing is we know that we don't have the technology to remove brown trout from these famous streams. Like, in Pennsylvania, we have Penn's, a Little Juniata, and Spring Creek, and Big Fishing Creek. And obviously from a social standpoint, Native Fish Coalition's not going to fight a socially, we realize that these fish have a social value and that fly fishermen do hold them in very high regard. And, we're not here to try to take people's, blue ribbon, brown trout fisheries where they grow to 20 inches. What we're essentially saying is there are areas where it's both feasible ecologically and feasible socially to, take a population of wild invasive brown trout that doesn't really grow beyond the size of the native brook trout and, do a removal there and, allow the brook trout to, to either come back where they've been lost or to, dominate the stream. And there's a lot of other ways, native brook trout conservation can happen without just removal. Removal is a very small part of it. And, it's actually probably there's a lot more that you can do when you have brown trout and brook trout together to favor those brook trout without simply removing. I mean, if you look at states around Pennsylvania, like West Virginia and Maryland, they're basically taking some research that was done within Pennsylvania and ironically isn't used in Pennsylvania that shows that if you manage brook trout populations at more than just a tiny trickle, if you take the big main stem stream that might be smallmouth water, might be brown trout water in terms of an angler's perception, and you manage brook trout in all the tributaries and that large main stem, you have much more stable and healthy populations. And what I mean by manage them is no stocking. So obviously you have to have stocking reform. You can't be adding invasive trout species on top of the ones that already exist there in the wild. And then the second thing is, making brook trout catch and release. There's data from Maryland that shows that did help their brook trout population in the Savage River. And not only did it help the brook trout in there and sustain a 365-day-a-year wild native brook trout trophy fishery, but it also is a great tool in educating the public. And then the third thing would be allowing harvest of non-natives and invasive trout species by anglers in those watersheds. So essentially, you're not removing those fish. You're not going through with rotenone or electroshocking pack, but you're allowing anglers who want to keep something for the table to harvest those fish a little bit. So, those kinds of regulations are working like gangbusters in Maryland. West Virginia is using them. Virginia and the National Park Service and the Shenandoah has those. So there's kind of this recipe for success for native brook trout that even in the face of some wild invasive brown trout, these fish and populations seem to be holding their own in a lot of these areas where this is undertaken.
Today's episode is sponsored by Jackson Hole Fly Company. They've been designing and manufacturing fly fishing equipment and flies since 1978 in their home base in Wyoming. In 2020, they launched jhflyco.com and started selling gear directly online to anglers all over the country. You can go ahead and right now and check out their huge selection of rods, reels, fly lines, tools, accessory. And right now, if you go to jhflyco.com/swing, you can get 25% off your first order. Just like Amazon, they'll ship everything directly to your door, saving you time and money. But unlike Amazon, you'll be supporting a great fly shop and this podcast by simply grabbing a few products, maybe just a couple of flies. Check it out. There we go. Get free shipping right now. All orders over $50 and get that 25% off your first order. jhflyco.com/swing. Okay, back to the show. And at what point, this is maybe more of a larger picture, but at what point do brown trout become, essentially a wild fish, native fish more, how long does it take until that fish, or will it always be an invasive fish, even say 500 years from now?
Yeah, that's a good question, Dave. So invasive is a simple definition. It just means non-native, which means that something did not evolve there. So if you look at an organism, it's got all these tools in its genetic code, and those tools are acquired over how long, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years, however long it has evolved to tailor and adapt itself to its environment. It's custom built, essentially, for where it evolved. So brown trout are, evolved, obviously, Europe or wherever, Northern Africa. So they're non-native. And then something that's non-native isn't always necessarily invasive. Invasive implies that there is ecological or economic harm. So as I told you, brown trout are top 30 in the world out of 4,000 to 5,000 most damaging invasive species. So brown trout are really heavy on that damage part. And it's not just brook trout. I mean, it's, there's evidence against, darters, endangered crayfish here in the East. I mean, it's totally a full-scale ecological, negative for those cold water ecosystems and the food webs. So, they really won't ever become native because, that adaptation, has been over millions of years for them.
Right. So they won't be native, but they could become maybe in some areas not invasive.
Well, that's the hard part is that right now we're still seeing, tons of research come out showing that negative effect on the ecosystem. And what we find is, at least from what we can see, there's not really a time where the damage kind of levels out or it reverses. An example would be, let's take a look at invasive lake trout out west. I'm sure you're familiar with the Yellowstone lake.
Yep.
Yeah. So what you have is you have Yellowstone cutthroat trout. You have invasive lake trout that were put out there, and they prey on the Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So when that happened, those Yellowstone cutthroat trout had a life history strategy where they run out of the lake up into tributaries to spawn. When the lake trout ate them, the lake trout did not adapt that same life history strategy. So all the predators, grizzly bears, bald eagles, that, required that, life history strategy to eat in the tributaries were disrupted. And you had, skinny bears and, birds cannibalizing each other because they couldn't have Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So it was a whole entire food web impact. And, when the removal efforts started and the Yellowstone cutthroat numbers came back up, obviously a lot of that got better. So what happened was those lake trout ate, all the food, in the lake that they could. And you had a trophy invasive species that was introduced. And then once they cycled through all the food and, burned through it unsustainably, they stunted out at, 20 inches or so, tiny, like small lake trout. So that lack of sustainability and then the fish stunting out is called boom and bust kind of dynamics. Or a lot of times boom and bust dynamics are when they proliferate to a high level and then the population crashes. So this is a very common, concept with invasive species. And that's why, to your question about will they ever become native, when you make such large scale disruptions to the food web with an invasive species, it's really hard to undo that.
Yeah. Or I guess the question would be, will they ever become not invasive?
Yeah. So they would have to, all that harm would have to go away for them to be not, invasive.
Right. They will always be an invasive species, essentially. That's no matter what. Even if we catch and kill a lot of brown trout in a system to down where there's only a few, they still will be invasive species because that's what they do. They eat other fish.
Yes. Now, to your point, though, in the Savage River in Maryland, this is where those three kind of, catch and release, non-native harvest, and managing at watershed scale kind of concepts have been implemented. And there is actually a micro population of brown trout in the Savage that is, sampled. They find a couple one year, none the next, and they find a couple more, but they can never take hold. It seems at this point, because, the management is for wild native brook trout, and the density of wild native brook trout is just, so great that it makes it hard for them to invade and makes it hard for them to take over.
Right. To take over, to basically get a population going. Yeah. It makes it hard for them to start a healthy population, essentially.
Exactly. Because, so while there's no safe amount of invasive fish species, like I said, removal completely is not our only tool. And we do have all these other tools that we're currently not using in Pennsylvania. It's very interesting. There's a very bright individual out west in Utah, I believe. Her name's Dr. Phaedra Buddy, and she does research on the effects of invasive brown trout on cutthroats. I forget if they're Lahontan or I think it's they're in the Logan River. I forget which ones they are. But anyway, what she found was she measured a stream that increases in elevation, and she was surveying it for brown trout and cutthroat trout. And the curious part is that what she expected to find was she expected to find brown trout up until a certain elevation when the water cooled down, and the cutthroat, would then dominate with the colder water, because we kind of have tunnel vision on that water temperature factor. So she expected to find a switch at that temperature kind of point. But what she actually found was she found that the brown trout stopped once the native cutthroats hit a certain density. And this is a concept that's called density-dependent biotic resistance, meaning that, there is a resistance that native fish have to invasive species at certain densities, it seems like. Now, there needs to be more research into this, but there was another paper that she was a part of called the invasive native paradox. And it basically looked at, why do brook trout, when they're invasive in Colorado, do awesome? And why are they declining in their native range in the East? We kind of see this paradox where it's like,
that's right.
Yeah. So And then with cutthroat trout, some of these cutthroat trout are doing great. I think they put Bonnevilles in a tailwater in Arkansas or something.
Yeah.
And then they have their own conservation issues out west. And the same is true of brown trout. Native brown trout in Sweden, and they're actually negatively affected by invasive brook trout out there. So you have this non-native native paradox. And essentially, as part of this paper, she mentioned that, there's this thought that we have to get rid of all of them, and that maybe, I'm sure it was based on her previous work, maybe tipping the scales or tipping the balance in some cases might be effective. And, that's probably in fisheries management, whether it's regulations to favor native trout or regulations to allow more harvest of invasive trout, where we probably don't try hard enough, or kind of, you miss all the shots you don't take kind of thing.
Right. And you mentioned the how to manage brook trout. So you mentioned no stocking, catch and release, and then harvest of non-native. So when you say that, are we talking, so for example, I guess you mentioned smaller streams, larger streams, but you're really talking, it could be larger streams. So you could go down into one of your popular streams, whatever that is in Pennsylvania. And yeah,
you could, but that's where you kind of hit that socially, that social factor of, we do acknowledge that invasive trout species have a social value. I love to fish for wild invasive brown trout. I love brown trout as a species in their native range. I was actually out until 3:30 a.m. this morning, night fishing for wild invasive brown trout in a local Pennsylvania spring creek. So, I love fishing for these fish too. And, where the public is valuing these fish, that's not the place to go and do these, that's a hill that you don't want to die on.
Okay. So where would you go for, let's say, the no stocking, the catch and release, the harvest of non-native fish? Where in Pennsylvania might you do that?
That's an excellent question, and something I'd love to talk about. So in Pennsylvania, you have the Little J, you have Spring Creek, you have Big Fishing Creek, you have the Lackawanna, you have Penns Creek, and all these areas where, famous rivers where the public is not going to be accepting of invasive brown trout removal, or even just harvest regulations in a lot of cases. But in terms of, if you're in native fish conservation, you want to look at, where's the low hanging fruit? Where can it make an impact without, fighting, a lot of these kind of battles that you're not going to win? So there's, in our northern tier, there are a lot of freestone streams in like the Potter, Tioga kind of county area. If someone's looking at the state of Pennsylvania and you're picturing New York sitting on top of it like a book on a table, those counties that touch the New York border in PA, streams like, if you look at what other states are doing, our kind of management areas should probably be up there with the catch and release, the managing at watershed scale and allowing the harvest of non-natives like Kettle Creek, Pine Creek, Cedar Run, and Slate Run. And, there's a whole bunch of other watersheds up there where no one goes up there to fish for wild invasive brown trout. I mean, they do, but they don't it's not a trophy fishery. They'd be just as happy catching a brook trout.
Gotcha. Right. Makes sense. It's a size thing. So literally it is a thing like, hey, these famous rivers with giant brown trout are well known. Don't mess with those.
Yeah.
We don't care if brook trout go extinct in those areas. That's part of the potential. But what you're saying is
I wouldn't go that
upstream.
Far. There's still things we could do to manage for brook trout in those larger streams without removing brown trout from them. Like you could still do catch and release for brook trout at watershed scale in Penns Creek. Penns Creek is an example where we've seen an uptick in native brook trout in the main stem in the past 4 to 5 years. And that's actually a population that has multiple different streams coming into it. And, brook trout we'd really like to keep around. So while, it wouldn't be socially acceptable to say, let's drag all the brown trout out of Penns Creek, you could certainly still protect brook trout through catch and release regulations. You could, look at their life history in Penns Creek and try to protect aspects of their life history and how they move and stuff like that. There's things that you can do
Yep, gotcha.
Yeah.
So there is stuff like you mentioned. There's the sedimentation, there's the land use, there's still climate change things like. So there are other things. This isn't not just a one trick pony where you're just saying, hey, we either remove them or we don't. There's literally it's like a the toolbox, right? This is one little tool in the toolbox, and what you're saying is the upper basin are areas where we can actually really restore or recover. Is that kind of the focus here in those areas where people aren't focused on giant brown trout?
Yeah, well, I think that's the area we like to focus, because that's where some of the healthiest brook trout populations are, especially, Kettle Creek and some of the larger other streams up there. But it's also because of that social factor where, there really a lot of the large brown trout up there are stocked. Unfortunately, there's private clubs that are stocking massive, pellet fed brown trout, but the wild brown trout up in that area on average are not much larger than the brook trout. So that's an area where, we would like to kind of choose the brook trout over the invasive species from a management perspective. And I should be pointed out that, like, when you talk about doing restoration, I mean, I'm sure you've seen examples near you at home. When you think about restoration, one thing you think about is money, right? I mean, what's it going to cost to get the Klamath dams out? What's it going to cost to get, and that's that's money well spent right there.
Yeah. Like, where could that money be? That's the whole thing, is like, okay, cost benefit. Where could we use that money? If we don't use it in the dams, where else can we put it to help these fish, right?
Exactly. But, I'm a big fan of those dam removals, and it's well worth the money, to recover wild native steelhead and wild native Chinook salmon. But the kind of mind-blowing thing is, Dave, in our case, if you look at the cost of implementing the recipe for success that Maryland, West Virginia, and Virginia have implemented in some of these watersheds, the kind of three-headed strategy of catch and release, no stocking reform, no stocking invasive species, and then harvest non-natives, it's free. Not only is it free, I mean, it's ink on paper.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's free.
Yeah, catch and release, free.
Right.
Harvest non-natives and invasive species, free. And guess what? Kettle Creek in northern Pennsylvania, I got the stocking receipts from PA Fish and Boat and counted up all the cooperative nurseries, hatcheries, and all the state fish. And, you're probably, for the whole watershed, you're at like somewhere near 40 to 50,000 invasive trout dumped in a year. You could be saving millions of dollars. It's cost saving. It's not spending money.
That's crazy. Why do you think Pennsylvania, as compared to these other states who are doing it, why do you think Pennsylvania hasn't implemented these three easy, low-cost options?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and there's a clear reason for it. In Pennsylvania, we're 30, 40 years behind a lot of these other states, because essentially in Pennsylvania, their main focus is, we have PA Fish and Boat. Most states have Department of Natural Resources. We have PA Fish and Boat, and then we have a DCNR, which is Department of Conservation Natural Resources. So PA Fish and Boat is not really the conservation arm of fisheries management. I mean, on paper, there's some PDFs where they claim that they are, but that is kind of separated in our state. So PA Fish and Boat does exactly what the name says. It's all about, stocking fish and anglers and boating. So their focus is just selling licenses. And that financially, they're in a lot of trouble right now, because they raise roughly, when you add up all the Great Lakes, rainbow trout they stock in Erie, and, all the invasive trout they stock in the streams, not in the Great Lakes, and the cooperative nurseries, there's somewhere around roughly 5 million trout a year. And that's expensive. I mean, it is. I saw a 2009 number that was like $12.4 million. And that's obviously only grown with inflation, cost of gas to truck these invasive species around, dump them in the creek and drive back, and, harvesting the menhaden out of, the Chesapeake Bay, and then grinding them down into fish pellets. That's a whole nother issue with striped bass. But it takes a lot of money, a lot of effort, a big carbon footprint for sure to stock all these invasive fish species. And Pennsylvania Fish and Boat gets most of their money from angler license sales. They get some federal money through the Dingle-Johnson excise tax, like when you buy some tackle or gas for your boat. But most of it is when you purchase a license and then you purchase a trout stamp. So what they have been experiencing is an increase in costs and a kind of reduced amount of customer base buying fishing licenses. So their costs are going up. The amount of people, they hired a third party to do a business analysis on their organization, Penn State Smeal College of Business. And Penn State basically said you're overcommitted financially and your customer base is not there to keep up with your expenses, and you have to cut trout, you have to cut hatcheries. And that's just a financial report, Dave. That has nothing to do with ecological, invasive threats or anything like that. So that was in 2017, they got that bit of information. I think that was triggered by concerns about their finances. So they didn't take the recommendations. They still kept producing the same amount of invasive trout species. What they did was they rated a taxpayer conservation grant called Growing Greener 2 for like $27.5 million. And most of that went to hatcheries, just fixing the hatchery.
Right. God. So there's basically this, so you got all this going on, which again, it's like any, group, agency, business, there's always struggles. So that is a big struggle for them, I think, maybe getting over. But like you say, back to the start, you see optimism right here. You see that the fact that this is not a hard lift, that probably with the right influence, maybe more of like your group, you talked about your group, maybe with the getting involved, it could help them see the light essentially.
I think the question I can address kind of us working with them, but kind of the bigger question, the optimism, what if we took our foot off the native brook trout's neck? That is the question. We've never seen what they can do without us constantly assaulting them with invasive hatchery fish.
Right. Well, we've seen them in other states, right? That's what you're saying.
But within Pennsylvania, we don't have a single regulation in Pennsylvania specific for native brook trout. We haven't even started trying. There's a lot of doomsday kind of mentality out there, but we haven't even started trying to not exterminate them with invasive species yet. And, there's all these myths swirling around that brook trout are fragile. They're too fragile to save. Climate change is going to eradicate them. And there's also these myths around that, invasive brown trout are like these super adaptive, always like more adaptive creatures. And they forget that the human charity that they've gotten has been just
we love them.
Launching an invasion every year. If some die, we put more in. We put more. We're not doing that for the brook trout, obviously, and there's reasons because you don't want to stock hatchery fish over native fish. But anyway, the point is that if that Kettle Creek watershed is an example, I told you, is 40 to 50 invasive trout species. What could those brook trout do in that watershed without 40 to 50,000 11-inch invasive competitors, pushing them out of thermal refuge? The invasive fish species is part of climate change because the climate change is going to make the real estate that these fish push brook trout out of even more important. So, if you just did, we have examples all over Pennsylvania where stocking has stopped and brook trout have rebounded. Now, this has only been in like tiny little streams, not in watersheds. So the benefits are not really as significant. But we know that not dumping invasive fish on brook trout works. So that's the reason to be optimistic is we haven't tried 3 free to cost saving, management levers we could pull to greatly change brook trout's fortune. And the other thing with climate change is there's some, evidence that a lot of these canopies and these dense coniferous forests with hemlocks and white pines will be more buffered to the effects of climate change than some of these, kind of lowland valley streams that don't have a lot of spring influence. So, and the other aspect, a reason to be really optimistic about brook trout, Dave, is anglers are not aware of the field of conservation genetics. When you talk to anglers and you say, do you know what, conservation genetics is, or do you know, was anyone aware that native brook trout have the ability to adapt to stressors and change their genes over time? That's not something that's at the forefront of people's minds. And, brook trout can adapt to, stressors. The question with climate change is, will they be able to adapt fast enough? And this is actually what scientists are working on right now, is looking at that adaptive capacity and how fast can we make it happen. And the thing is that, like you mentioned the word tool belt or toolbox before.
Yeah.
Every gene that a brook trout has is part of that tool belt to survive. Maybe one gene allows them to, survive increased water temperature. Maybe another gene allows them to survive a flood. Maybe another gene allows them to survive a drought. So you have all these different tools in this toolbox. And when we kind of degrade their populations and cause them to decline using invasive fish species, then they lose tools out of their tool belt. That gene's lost forever, and it might have been very valuable. So we can maximize this adaptive capacity by keeping large, robust brook trout populations today, allowing them to move and share their genes with other brook trout populations, and just let that process of adaptive capacity happen. And, some of the things that we're doing that I said are free to cost saving, we could increase that adaptive capacity by removing barriers to their movement.
Yeah.
That's where the optimism comes from, Dave, is that, all these kind of myths about the fragility and the hopelessness, and that's not what fisheries scientists are looking at. That's not how they see it. They're more just kind of, frustrated overall at, the low-hanging fruit that we're not picking.
Quick break for a word from our sponsor. With more than 40 years of experience in coffee, the Anglers Coffee Team roasts a full range of coffee with one goal in mind: delivering excellent coffee to every single angler. Responsibly sourced from farms using sustainable growing practices, you can rest easy knowing you are doing your part. Roasted and shipped within 48 hours to assure freshness. For me, it's all about that freshness and taste. When I crack open a bag of Anglers in the morning, I feel good because I know not only does it taste great, but I am supporting great movements along the way. With a blend for every taste, a dry dropper on the go tea bag option, and a roast sampler, Joe at Anglers is serving your needs. It's time to step up to better coffee and more impact for the fish species and causes we love. You can head over to wetflyswing.com/anglers right now to grab a bag of greatness today. That's Anglers, ANGLERS, to make a change today. And I was just going to highlight, we said at the start, the episode we had, it was actually Maine Fly Guys, Greg Labonte, up a little bit north of you. He was talking about some of the same issues. But I want to go back to brook trout. Maybe, can you talk about a little bit on just the life history of a brook trout? I'm not sure if you can describe that. Just tell us, and then maybe go back to also life history, and then if we have a little time here, just on the history of how we got to where we are.
Yeah, so the interesting thing about brook trout is that, it used to be believed much more so than today that these were very sedentary individual, fish. And at least in Pennsylvania, our understanding of that changed when a fisheries scientist named Dr. Shannon White, who was at Pennsylvania State University, doing her research as part of her PhD, she did a project in the Loyalsock Creek. And what she did was she came up with a novel way of looking at riverscape genetics and basically the genes of brook trout and the gene flow or movement of their genes, like when they move and spawn with other populations. So what she did was she took, telemetry tags so she could track brook trout's movement, and she implanted them in brook trout. And then what she also did is she took fin clips to look at the genes of the different brook trout tributaries that all flow into the Loyalsock Creek in Pennsylvania. So she looked at an entire almost, watershed and looked at the genes and tracked the brook trout to see how were they moving. You could see physically that they're moving through the telemetry data, but through the genetics data, if brook trout in stream A turns out to be related to brook trout in stream C, movement occurred between those two streams. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So the life history of brook trout in that watershed, it showed that somewhere around up to 18% of brook trout were moving from these tributaries using this important large main stem habitat that we think of like smallmouth water or brown trout water, and then going up another tributary to share their genes. And that obviously is driving that adaptive capacity, because if, let's say, drought wipes out brook trout population A, you have your two lone survivors or whatever that might have had favorable genes that allowed them to survive that. You want them to go share those genes with everyone else. You want everyone else to have that tool. So you want that gene flow to occur. And that was part of their life history. They'd go down in the main stem and go up another tributary. So the thing that's relevant to note here is those transponders, the telemetry tags, only lasted about 6 months. And I think they stopped working in about December. So brook trout spawn in like October and like November. And we probably would have seen, I would think, a lot more movement had the telemetry tags lasted for a year, would be my layperson's guess, just knowing that brook trout spawn in these small tributaries, sometimes even into December. And so, this is a very important part of their life history. But it's not just for gene flow, Dave. The other thing is that, have you ever heard, brook trout, they live in small, infertile headwater environments. There's not a lot of food in there. They're kind of sterile, acidic streams. Well, there's a lot more food in these large waterways. And something that people forget in Pennsylvania is every stream in the state is cold enough for brook trout in December. So people think about climate change. They think about, where we're managing brook trout. They forget that there's a whole smorgasbord of food-rich, large waterways that brook trout can use their life history to go in those food-rich areas and grow during the colder months. And in fact, we find them, I find brook trout in my neck of the woods in smallmouth bass streams and warm water streams in, February. And, after they spawn, they, have a caloric deficit. They use a lot of energy. And then some of these, brook trout seem to be going down and, using this large food-rich area to replace that caloric deficit and grow.
And would these be the large food-rich areas? Would these be areas like the famous areas where there are giant brown trout?
Absolutely. So, that these areas, and like we mentioned, so we have data from the Southern Appalachians showing that invasive trout species act effectively like a barrier sometimes, just like a perched culvert or something like that. So if you have a barrier, let's call it like a biotic or biological barrier, the question is, are, brook trout less likely to travel down into these systems and take advantage of these food-rich resources to grow if invasive brown trout are there? And the answer is yes, because we have studies from the driftless region where brown trout are removed and brook trout migrate downstream and they increase their growth rates.
And so if that's the case, if there's, these fish that are these brook trout that need to migrate down, and I'm not, there's probably a lot of diversity, but say population needs to migrate down the larger river to grow, to get bigger. And if there's brown trout there, they can. Is that impacting them? I mean, because it sounds like we're not going to be addressing the brown trout as much in these popular fisheries. Is that still a concern, or do you think?
Yeah, the brown trout are definitely still a concern in those fisheries. It's not that the brown trout aren't invasive at those fisheries. It's from a conservation perspective, there's a social barrier to kind of doing removal there. So, that's why we would focus on those other strategies we talked about, like maybe catch and release on brook trout, angler education, for buy-in with native brook trout conservation projects. There's also another conservation tool you have is barriers. So if you have a great native brook trout population, there are, trade-offs, but, conservation barriers are something we use out west that could be, employed, here. So there's all kinds of other tools we can use if there's a public social barrier to, removing invasive brown trout. So, obviously they're not going to be as effective, certainly in catch and release if you have invasive brown trout. But the other thing is, if you have a conservation barrier, you could always in one of the tributaries or something like that, do a project like that. That's where you need a real fisheries scientist.
Right. Yeah, that's true. There's some of this stuff we would have to follow up. So what would be like a conservation barrier? What would be an example of that?
Yeah. So an example of that would be when fisheries scientists make an impassable, usually vertical drop like a small, structure.
Yeah. So basically adding a barrier instead of removing barriers, you'd be adding a barrier.
Exactly. So, it's funny, and it illustrates how harmful these invasive fish are. We know how harmful barriers are to native trout. They're very harmful, but it's just a testament to how much, more, damaging these invasive brown trout and rainbow trout species are, that if you put a barrier in place, it allows the native trout to persist. So it really shows you which is the worst of the two evils. Now, it's not always that the barrier is the worst of the two evils. It's not like black and white. You could have an example where a barrier causes lack of genetic diversity, and then the population gets inbred and goes away. So that's why I said you need a fisheries scientist, a real professional to, evaluate these trade-offs and make the best decision. But we do see a lot of, decisions made by fisheries professionals where it saves a species of native trout. It was obviously the right choice. So it's a tough call, but, we leave it to the professionals.
That makes sense. Okay. And so on that life history, you mentioned there are some fish that are migrating down. Are there also lots of diversity there where some are not migrating at all and living in a small section of river up in these higher headwater streams, Brook trout, or do you think they're all migrating?
Yeah, no. Shannon White's study would suggest there is a large population of sedentary resident individuals. But the question is, I guess, is in that year that they were tracked, would those same fish that stayed be the movers next year, or would they be sedentary again? And I don't know the answer to that. So the question is this life history trait, and I'm not aware of what the specific stimuluses are for those fish to move out of, what versus who goes and who stays.
Yeah, right. There's some factor, right? Some environmental factor, probably.
Yeah. So like with steelhead, which you're very familiar with out in the West Coast, we see that when these dams come out, these populations of resident rainbow trout can convert to steelhead. So, the question is with brook trout, this, ace in the back pocket or kind of life history strategy that can be used to their advantage, even if all brook trout are not moving in a given year, does having that option in the coming years for different fish, provide a benefit? And, I don't have the definitive answer on that, but my thought would be, you would think it'd be good to have that option.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I just think of this like it'd be part of this is, you find your areas that are places where brook trout are still healthy and you protect those areas, right? And you really make sure those are good. And then you start working out from there, expanding out, connecting, those fish to other habitats. But there are some areas, like you said, that are just in brown trout. Everybody loves the fish that's the place maybe we're not going to do the heavy lifting, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's not the hill that, that's not the hill we're going to die on. There's, right now, just to put it in perspective for you, PA NFC, we're asking for one stream in the whole state for native brook trout.
Oh, wow.
We have 86,000 miles, second only to Alaska, of free-flowing, or not free-flowing, dammed up, but of flowing water. And we don't have one stream in the state. We don't have one regulation in the state for native brook trout. Native brook trout are our state fish. They're listed in the Pennsylvania Wildlife Action Plan. And PA Fish and Boat won't create one regulation for them.
Wow.
They won't create one stream to manage specifically for native brook trout.
That's amazing. Are they endangered? Are they listed federally?
No, they're not currently listed as threatened or endangered.
Is that? I mean, there must be tons of studies there. Is that something that's they're just not? That means the populations are healthy enough that they're not threatened or endangered?
Well, I mean, that's a even larger discussion. I mean, the even larger discussion there is the International Union of Conservation of Nature came out with a report that roughly a third of freshwater fish are at risk of extinction. And there was another study that came out that said that 33% of non-threatened fish listed as not threatened are experiencing dramatic population declines. So not having that threatened or endangered status doesn't mean that they're doing good. And like I said, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat is flying with the blinders on. They're not really they don't know how much brook trout they have they're not effectively currently inventorying it or checking it. They're just kind of closing their eyes.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Oh, so there's not even, there's no studies that even say how many fish are there right now.
They don't know. They have no idea. Yeah. I mean, they're essentially just stocking 5 million invasive hatchery fish a year and telling everyone the brook trout are okay, but they have no clue. They're not. So basically, to go back to your original question there about, we don't have one regulation or specifically for native brook trout. They just made the first regulation specifically to protect invasive brown trout in these kind of trophy areas we're talking about. So they did make an invasive brown trout protection regulation, but they don't have one for their state fish, which is a native species, and it's listed as highest conservation need. So, the messaging to the public is very backwards on brook trout from PA Fish and Boat. And one thing that fishery science shows is that if you don't have public education, if you don't have public buy-in, then none of this really conservation initiatives take off much, because if you don't educate the public, they might sabotage a brook trout restoration project by dumping invasive brown trout in it or something like that. So that is a kind of a known commodity that if you don't educate the public and if you do not communicate the importance of these fish, any restoration efforts are less likely to be effective. Not that PA Fish and Boat's really doing any, but.
And that's probably with the Native Fish Coalition. Is that a focus for you when you're doing this, is thinking like, how do we educate and how do you guys do that? Because it seems like maybe a challenge where you're trying to educate and there's a lot of myths out there and stuff. Like, how do you get it? What's your goal to make sure that these things get enacted? How are you guys going to do that?
Yeah, so our strategy at PA Native Fish Coalition is, first off, we're doing grassroots education. We have events, we go out, we talk to people at fly fishing trade shows. We're at the Lancaster show. We do communication with people on social media. We have events like stream cleanups and stuff like that where we talk to people. We write articles. We do a lot of writing. I don't know if do you get Fly Fisherman magazine?
I have. Yeah, I don't currently, but yeah,
Okay.
I love, Fly Fisherman, I know out of our listeners, we got out of all the magazines, I think Fly Fisherman is definitely the most read. And then I think number one might be Trout Unlimited.
Yeah. So I had a publication in Fly Fisherman magazine this past spring. I think it came out in like March. And I basically did a layman's literature review of management and mismanagement of native brook trout in Pennsylvania. And, I got a lot of positive feedback from that. So we do a lot of writing. We do op-eds. I've done op-eds in local media sources. And we try to reach out to anglers, but also non-anglers, because, all the hikers, bikers, kayakers, they're all stakeholders in this, So that's the education piece. Then there's the advocacy piece. And what we have done is, when PA Native Fish Coalition first formed, we reached out to PA Fish and Boat, and we quickly saw that there was no appetite to do anything. I mean, fishing license sales are king there, and it's just really not productive talking with them anymore, really. So, we do maintain some contact, but they actually go out of their way not to talk about brook trout, not to, they don't do any Facebook really posts on like the harms of invasive species on brook trout, or they don't really echo a lot of what the Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture puts out. So where we're more focused on the people that hold PA Fish and Boat accountable. DCNR has a mission to protect native biodiversity in their wild areas, state parks and state forests. So, we've talked to DCNR a lot, and now DCNR is actually coming to PA Fish and Boat and forming a work group to, try to get them to stop stocking invasive species in their areas they're trying to manage for native biodiversity. One thing I'd like to do is, reaching out, and I have in the past, and I'd like to this is where the education comes in, is reaching out to the legislature. There's House and Senate Fish and Game committees who are supposed to be, supervising PA Fish and Boat. It's gone really far off the rails, but talking to them and trying to, get accountability. If nothing else, financial accountability. I mean, ecological accountability may not be a big talking point with the legislature, but I mean, finance-wise, fishing licenses are, going up in price, and fishing access is, becoming an issue in some areas of Pennsylvania. So there's different levers to pull and to talk about there, and to try to hold these people accountable. And the education all feeds back into it. The more you educate people, doing podcasts like this and asking people to reach out to their legislators on stocking reform. asking people to call their fish and game departments and ask for more native, fishing opportunities. And in terms of local accountability, there's organizations that are basically saying they're doing conservation, and there's the question of, well, what is conservation? They say that stocking invasive brown and rainbow trout is a quote unquote conservation project. Reaching out to those people, in a friendly manner and trying to talk to them and get them to not do those things, and then if they're not willing to change, holding them accountable. That all factors into the strategy of educate and then advocate and try to get these changes.
Right. Wow. Yeah. No, it sounds like you guys are doing some amazing stuff. And I think that's something we hear a lot about, right? The grassroots. If you want to get something done, whether that's like Yvonne Chenard with Patagonia or any of these amazing groups and people, it's like you start at the grassroots, because that's right. Would never underestimate what a small group of individuals can do. And that's where you guys are starting.
Oh, yeah.
This is great. Let's take it out of here, James, here. And I got a quick little rapid fire section here. You've mentioned quite a bit on this, some groups, but who would be, like, if somebody wanted to take this further, the Native Fish Coalition, are there other groups in PA, other groups nationally you would recommend people check in with to kind of help learn more about what we're talking about here?
Yeah. So there's, NANFA, which is the North American Native Fish Association, and they put out a lot of good content, particularly on smaller native fish that like minnows and species and darters and stuff like that. And then another people that seem to be advocates for native fish, and in a lot of cases, backcountry hunter and anglers.
Oh, yeah.
From what I've seen from them, seem to be pretty native fish centric. There's a lot of good organizations out there. Trout Unlimited does a lot of good things for native fish, obviously with like the dam removal advocacy they're doing. There's the Klamath, and then there's, the Pebble Mine was great. The only thing with Trout Unlimited also has some things that they kind of have a decision to make, whether they're going to support, native fish or invasive fish in some places. And, it gets down to the term conservation. There's fishing and there's conservation. And I think that those two different disciplines have been kind of washed or mixed together in some kind of areas where it's questionable. Because if you look at conservation, you're really trying to protect native biodiversity. So, if you do a project to establish, a large fishable population of wild invasive brown trout, that food web is going to suffer, the biodiversity is going to suffer there. So you're really decreasing biodiversity. And there's no such thing as conservation of invasive species. So I would call that more of a social project, or maybe a water quality, it might help the Chesapeake Bay by reducing some nitrogen and sediment. But, when it comes to one thing I definitely want to talk about with the listeners is, like, you heard like the Field of Dreams analogy with like restoration. Like if you build it, they will come, right. We can just restore our way, out of trouble with native fish. The problem is, and I'll touch on this quickly, is what we see in a lot of the research and a lot of the case studies is when we take a stream that has native fish populations, native brook trout, and we do one of these big restorations where we come in and we put all these engineered log and wood and structures, they call them like lunker bunkers and root wads and all these big, deep overhanging structure. Research out of West Virginia and Wisconsin has shown that these structures often help the invasive trout species dominate and completely either eradicate or push out native brook trout, which is kind of counterintuitive. Because what happens is that these brown trout, invasive trout, is particularly in one case study, grew their population by pushing brook trout out of these habitat structures and use these habitat to grow and actually all but eliminate native brook trout from the watershed. And the irony is the project was done for native brook trout, and at this point, it may have wound up in their eradication.
I think that's a great example, but I think, and I think that a part of it is, what are your goals of the project? If your goals are to grow brown trout fish, then that's a great project. So I think, that's an example of somebody who just didn't have the right goals. It wasn't a successful project, but again, I think that part of our history is we're learning from our mistakes and we're doing it right now. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, like, we're not 100%, we don't know, like, even you and even me and everybody, we don't know exactly that this is all going to work. And that's the interesting thing, right?
Yes, that is true. But now we have the data to know that where you have what's called a sympatric population, where you have both, the native trout and the invasive trout, we have the data for brook trout anyway to know that if you do these large engineered structures that create deep overhanging habitat, we now know that the brook trout can't benefit from that and that the brown trout can use it to take over. But like you said, stream restoration is an evolving science. And what looks promising is some of these newer techniques where instead of trying to create a channel with all these habitat features, there's a shift in stream restoration that's happening out east, particularly in Pennsylvania, where you look at just excavating, silt and things that have built up over time from logging and deforestation. And you look at just creating a floodplain, an entire floodplain the stream can flood in, and not designing a channel and trying to keep it rigidly in place, but just letting the channel establish itself within the floodplain. Because these streams are dynamic things. They move, they switch braids, they'll dewater one channel. So, we're just finding out in general that trying to lock them down in one channel form,
Right.
it just doesn't work.
No, it doesn't. And that's the thing is that, the best thing is like Mother Nature, right? I mean, we can do whatever we want with designs, but at the end of the day, Mother Nature is the one that creates the habitat. So how do we, give it enough room to just do its own thing? I think that's the take-home message.
Exactly. If you try to make a stream do something it doesn't want to do, you're going to wind up with a bunch of, wooden and rock structures beat to crap. And, the angler that is walking the bank will, step over them when enough silt is deposited on them and the stream is moved out of the way.
Exactly. And I think it's all on a case-by-case basis. I mean, I'm sure there's places like that where that project would work great. It's just that, you know what I mean? Like, it's all case-by-case.
Yeah. There's areas around infrastructure. Like, I mean, if you got someone's house or if you got like a bridge or a big piece of public infrastructure, I mean, yeah, you have to armor up the banks and really hold the stream, in one area. How effective that'll be over time is, out the jury's out. But, obviously you have to save that house. You have to protect that bridge, whatever. I'm talking more about where it's done specifically for the brook trout.
Yeah, it's around infrastructure. Yeah, or brook trout, right. Well, give us one. I want to, Jane, take us out of here. I always love asking the podcast music questions. So do you listen to other podcasts or music, one or the other?
Yeah, I do listen to other podcasts. I just like seeing in general, like what the kind of mentality and the kind of cultural feel of the fly fishing community is. Since a lot of times that's who we're, working with and engaging in the conservation aspect. So I like to kind of keep my finger on the pulse, so to speak. I listen to Tom Rosenbauer's Orvis Fly Fishing Podcast. Since I'm a big time night fisherman and I've been doing that for, all kinds of trout, native and invasive, I get a kick out of listening to the Dominic Swentowski at Trout Bitten talk about, night fishing and that kind of stuff. Obviously I've listened to your podcast for a long time and have really enjoyed a lot of the episodes. And yeah, I mean, I kind of just try to take a whole breadth of what's going on out there and fly fishing. And, I read different magazines. And
do you have any podcasts in your queue right now that are not fly fishing, other podcast types of genres or, podcasts?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I like one that I really like is U.S. Fish and Wildlife has an awesome podcast. It's called Fish of the Week. And essentially it's not fishing related, but they take a lot of these native fish species.
Yep. Darters or whatever. Yeah.
Yeah. Or like sometimes like big head buffalo or ciscos or sucker species. Yeah. And they kind of
something that nobody is fishing for really, but is a cool fish.
Exactly. And, these are things that are swimming around your wading boots and have these incredible, life history strategies and these kind of important niches in the ecosystem. And, part of the reason why I think we all like fly fishing is we like the kind of we like how things work. We like, a lot of the interesting aspects about how these ecosystems function. So when you step in a river and there's maybe 3 non-game species that you understand what their role is in the food web, how their habitat, that really adds something for me when I can go in my streams. And last night I was night fishing. I put the spotlight in the stream. I was like, oh, there's a northern hogsucker. And, their last episode was about like hogsuckers and, how they kind of use camouflage and they don't really run right away. They kind of stay where they are. And, true to form what they said, I put the light on him and everything else ran away and he just hung out.
The flight or fright, or what is it? Yeah, you know what I mean? It's like that's one tactic. But as we head out of here, give us one call to action. Somebody's listening now. They've heard all this today. What is one thing they can do to get involved to help brook trout? I'm glad you brought that up because that's really my goal with these talks is, it centers on this call to action. So what I would say is if you're out there, and hey, I like fishing for, brown trout and rainbow trout too. Native fish conservation is not about hating anything, or hating one species, Yep. You guys aren't trying to eradicate brown trout from the planet. No, not possible, not trying to do it. But what I would say is, call or email your fish and boat or DNR, your fisheries managers, and ask them, for biggest thing we can do is stocking reform. Nationally, stocking reform should be our number one issue in native fish conservation because it's the damage we're paying to inflict. It costs real dollars and cents, big money. And it's, we can stop stocking of invasive species a lot faster than we can fix climate change. So reaching out to your fish and boat, your DNR, and asking your fisheries managers to enact common sense stocking reforms, reaching out to the, like every state's got one of those find your legislator tools where you just, you can send them an email them, tell them that this is an issue for you. And that, you would like to see stocking reform, to the benefit of native species. That's one of the biggest things we can do. One of the other things is just talk about it. If you read the article in Fly Fisherman, or if you listen to this podcast and, you learn about, hey, there's this whole other thing besides climate change and development, invasive fish species is just as dangerous, just as important to address. Talk about it to non-anglers. Talk about it to anglers. This is something that's just suffering in silence. It's not really, it's kind of the unspoken impairment that would probably be, one of the ones we're paying to create and easiest to at least, make a little bit better for these fish. So just the same thing we're doing. Educate, advocate, talk to your decision makers and tell people. That's the thing they can do. Perfect. All right, James, we'll send everybody out to nativefishcoalition.org if they want to connect more. And thanks for all your time today. This has been an amazing conversation. I think there's plenty of, more of these to come. So I definitely keep up the good fight and glad to have you there. Hey, thanks for the opportunity, Dave. My pleasure. That is a wrap. You can grab all of the show notes at wetflyswing.com. And please follow us on Instagram and share this episode out with someone you love. Please send me an email, dave@wetflyswing.com, if you have any feedback or want us to put together an episode on this podcast for you. Check in anytime. I hope you enjoyed this podcast and would love to meet up with you on the water. We have new fly fishing schools going all year long and all around the country. So if you want to connect, let's do it right now. All right, time to get out of here. I hope you have a great evening. I hope you have a great morning or great afternoon wherever in the world you are. And I appreciate you for stopping by and checking out the show today. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com.